Okay. All right, well, hello, my name is Allissa Reynolds. I'm a Firewise specialist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and I work in the central region of the state, which basically extends from Mille Lacs Lake down to the southern border. And I come to you with a background of forest management. I was a private forester in Wisconsin, a state forester in Minnesota. I've been a researcher out west. I studied the interactions between fire and climate change and vegetation, specifically looking at fuels. And now working for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to help landowners and community members prepare for wildfire. So I'm going to bring a little bit of information from all those different experiences into this presentation today, and hopefully give you some tips and tricks to be prepared in the event of a wildfire. So just real quickly, quick introduction to what wildland fire is. There are some distinct differences between a wildland fire and a fire in a structure or urban environment. So I just wanted to be clear on that right away. The wildland fire is an unplanned and uncontrolled fire with vegetative fuels and sometimes involving structures. So the differences between that and a structure fire is relatively a known situation. There's it's usually a single structure involved. There's a relatively known extent of what the contents of that structure are. A wildland fire is unplanned, so you don't know when it's going to happen. It's uncontrolled, so you don't know where it's going to occur or what really is going to be involved. So typically they start in the wildlands, so in the forest or the grasslands, sometimes in the ranges. But they can include all sorts of different things, not just the trees and the vegetation, but cabins and homes. If there's a community nearby, there can be infrastructure, power grids, power lines, gas lines, propane tanks, all sorts of different things. So it's an incredibly variable, incredibly complex situation a lot of times, and changes very quickly. So this fire here, this is a photo of the Camp Fire 2018. So this is a situation that we're seeing pretty regularly these days, and in fact, increasingly in the last decade or so. But this is a very large fire event, and in fact, this photo was taken in one of the earlier days before it got incredibly large. But you can just see the immense scale of this fire, and you can see, if you look on the right side of the slide, where it started in the forest and the wildland area there, relatively inaccessible, some forest roads there that are relatively steep and narrow, but it's also impacting that community on the left-hand side of the slide. So you start thinking about all the structures involved there, the different homes, the power grid, like I mentioned. There's a lot of dynamics going on with different jurisdictions, with fire departments and land management agencies. And then if there's public involved, which of course there always is, then there's going to be evacuations, and it's going to be a pretty chaotic situation, at least in the beginning, until resources get a handle on it and get an assessment of what's really involved. So I know we all hear a lot of stories in the news about big fires out west in California, or last year it was Oregon, Washington that made the news quite a bit. So if you're thinking that we don't really have this problem here in the Midwest, I want to introduce just a couple fires here that we've had in Minnesota and Wisconsin that have been quite large. So the Peshtigo fire, the biggest fire that we've had in this area, 1.2 million acres. I mean, that is incredibly huge. The Hinckley fire, also very large, 1,000 acres. The Moose Lake Cloquet fire, you've all probably heard about those as well. Granted, those were a different time. There was the logging boom in the late 1860s, 70s that left a lot of logging slash. But nonetheless, it just illustrates that these fires are possible, and if the conditions are right, it can happen here in the Great Lakes. And in fact, in more recent years, we have the Carlos Edge fire that occurred in 2000. That's just north of the metro area in the Carlos Avery Wildlife Management Area. That was about almost 9,000 acres. And that did burn a few structures. There's a number of communities that were evacuated. And that was a very large, complex fire event. And of course, in recent years, you've probably heard of the Boundary Waters fires, fire names like Ham Lake, Cavity Lake, Pagami Creek. Those type of large fires are occurring with somewhat regularity, and there's a number of reasons for that. The last two, the Green Valley and the German Road fire, coincidentally, those both happened, they started on the same day, May 14th, I believe it was, 2013. Both are about 7,000 acres, both impacted communities that had to be evacuated, and both burned structures. So just a few examples of some large fires we have had in the Midwest. So this is a problem that occurs almost every state in the country, certainly in Canada and Alaska. So it's a widespread problem, and it's been looked at by a number of people, and we're not exempt from that. So just real quick, I want to back up a little bit. I don't want to give the impression that fire is bad. Fire is a very essential and important process. In fact, it's what shaped the landscape that we see in the Great Lakes today. Many of the tree species and plant and animal communities as well are very dependent on fire. I like to think of it as kind of like nature's recycling mechanism. So it takes the nutrients that are in the vegetation, it returns some of those to the soil, some to the air and the water, of course, too. But it removes dead and dying vegetation and kind of wipes the slate clean, so to speak, and allows for new growth to occur. It opens up space from competition and just gives new growth a chance to get started. So it allows us to have a diversity of plant species and age classes, all of which is important for healthy and dynamic ecosystems. So where do these fires typically occur in Minnesota? So I put up these two different maps side by side because to me it's really interesting how the fires line almost perfectly up with the different biomes that we have in Minnesota. So just a little background, in Minnesota we do have 4 distinct biomes. So we have the prairie parklands in the west, the eastern broadleaf forest in the south, kind of extends from the southeast up to the northwest, the Laurentian mixed forest in the northeast, and then a small part of the northwest is the tallgrass aspen parklands. And all of those have fire in them to some degree, but it's really dependent on the fuels, and those biomes basically dictate that type of fuel that's available. So if we look at the the southwest, the prairie parklands, we typically have grass fires in that area. As it is prairie, it's generally flat, unforested. We do see quite a bit of prescribed burn activity in the southwest and a lot of agriculture burning. The southeast and that eastern broadleaf forest, that's where you see a lot of the deciduous trees. So your oak, maple, basswood, hickory, walnut, things like that. Those tree species aren't typically as flammable as some of the conifers that we see up north. So we don't generally see as much fire activity in that eastern broadleaf forest, although there is some. The story changes pretty dramatically though when you start looking at that Laurentian mixed forest, and that's where we start seeing a lot of the pine species, the red and white pine that's pretty iconic for Minnesota, as well as some of the black and white spruce and a bit of the swamps, tamarack swamps and cattails and things like that. So a lot more flammable fuel, also a little bit less populated. So fires that get established there have generally less chance of being reported very early. So they can get established sooner before we get a response to get them extinguished. So the image on the right here, each blue dot represents one single fire event that the Minnesota DNR has recorded. So I just want to point out that there are some blank spots there. The northeast, you'll see the Superior National Forest. There's the Chippewa National Forest and also Red Lake Nation. So they do have fires as well. They're just not recorded on this map. So at this point, you might be thinking, so why is this my problem? What do I as a homeowner and landowner need to be concerned about this with? Well, we like to think of firefighters as heroes, and there's a lot of news stories and sensational literature out there about these firefighter heroes. And yes, many of them are heroes. But if you think about this image right here, this is a structure firefighter. And I know that because he has that SCBA tank on his back, which allows him to breathe compressed oxygen when he goes inside a structure. We as wildland firefighters, we don't carry that. And there's one main reason, and that's typically we're not entering structures. So if you think about why structure firefighters do that, it's generally not to save the building itself, it's to rescue the people inside. And so we as wildland firefighters, we do everything we can to protect lives and preserve life, but that includes firefighters as well. So if we go into a community, our first attempt to preserve life is to get people out of harm's way. So we're going to be evacuating buildings and communities. And generally, like I mentioned before, in those large, complex, and dynamic fire environments, we don't have the resources to go in and save every structure. So we're going to be moving as quickly as we can, as efficiently as we can through that community, making people are out of harm's way. And that's essentially the best that we can do in a lot of those situations where they're very chaotic and very complex. Something that that I can't give a presentation about wildland fire and not just touch on climate change, because we all know climate is changing, and that's impacting our local weather patterns. And it's also basically exacerbating the fire problem that's been in place that we've been dealing with for a number of years. So the changing climate is increasing our temperatures, as we all know. We're seeing longer snow-free periods, longer growing seasons, and that's changing the types and growth rates of vegetation. We're seeing large swings between wet and dry periods, and we're seeing very intense wind events, lightning, and storm events. We're also seeing faster drying periods. So all of those are exacerbating the fire problem. We're seeing more fires, we're seeing more intense fires. The fire behavior is often less predictable because of that extended season. And there's also increased opportunities for insects and diseases due to the warmer winter temperatures. So just real quickly, here we are late June 2021, and we just hit a record-breaking event the other day, just about 2 days ago, the National System for Wildland Fire Response. We have this preparedness level system of 1 through 5. So 1 would be very minimal fire activity. There's abundant resources to handle all of those fires. And the other extreme would be a preparedness level 5, where basically all the resources that are trained and able to respond to wildland fires are doing so. So if you have another large event that happens when you're at preparedness level 5, your ability to call in resources is extremely limited. Well, I think it was Monday or Tuesday of this week, a couple days ago, we hit preparedness level 4 for the first time in June. So that just further substantiates that claim that climate is changing, that we have a serious fire problem, and it seems like it's getting worse every year. So this year is shaping up to be another record breaker. In fact, in Minnesota, it already is breaking records. So here we are, 2021. This is yesterday, June 22nd. I took this image from one of our fire tracking systems that we use in the state. And we've had about 1,350 fires in Minnesota this year for roughly 34,000 acres. So again, if you think back to that slide I showed previously with the biomes on the one side and the fire occurrence on the other, lines up really nicely with that Laurentian mixed forest, but extends into some other areas as well. So this is what we see on any given year. Of course, this year is, like I mentioned, a little bit more extreme, but that seems to be the trend. So if you think about how these fires start, typically, well, this data was gathered in Minnesota from the DNR in 2018. So of all the fires that the DNR responded to and tracked, 98% of these fires were human caused. So whether that's equipment or arson, debris burning, unintentional or intentional, 98% human caused. So, I talked earlier about how fire is a natural process and it's very good and essential for the environment. It's basically a problem now because we're building our homes in what we call the wildland urban interface. So we are in the fire environment. Well, this data here tells me that we're actually contributing to that fire problem, and that actually, if you look at it from a controls perspective, if we're the ones starting the fire and we're building our houses in the way of the fire, that gives us a lot of control in terms of how we respond and prepare for fires. So just a little firefighter 101 here. This is what we show some new entry-level firefighters when we're teaching them the basic dynamics of fire and how to control wildland fires. So the image on the left, the fire triangle, you'll see fire, oxygen, and heat. Those are the 3 components needed to sustain fire. If you look at the fire behavior triangle on the right side, that's, when we talk about fire behavior, we're talking about flame length, rate of spread, energy release, things like that. So that's driven by the topography the weather, and the fuel. So what I want to point out here is that the common denominator between these two fire triangles is the fuel. So interestingly enough, fuel is also the one thing in both of these triangles that we can control. And it's also something that we can control ahead of time. So if you think about it again from this perspective, it really gives us humans a lot of control when it comes to managing fire. So another, just a little bit of background on fire terminology. So we talk about surface fuel, ladder fuel, and tree crowns in this image. So surface fuel, you're basically considering all the fuel on the surface, like the grass, the logs, the small shrubs, all the flammable material right on the ground. So if you have a fire in that environment, it's generally pretty benign. It's pretty easy for firefighters to get a handle on a fire that's a surface fire. The ones that you see on the news, the extreme fire events that are up in the treetops, that's a crown fire. That's very extreme, very difficult to control. When we as firefighters see a crown fire or that kind of activity, that's when we draw back. We call in aerial resources, helicopters, air tankers. Our ground efforts at that point are pretty much futile. So the way we can address these fires and keep them surface fires and prevent them from getting into the crowns is to disrupt that connection or remove that what we call ladder fuel. So the ladder fuel are the smaller trees, shrubs, lower branches, that vegetative material that connects the canopy of the tree to the surface fuel. So talking now about Firewise, what is the Firewise program? This particular home here, it was actually in Central Washington in the early 2000s. This home was involved in a wildfire. You can see all the char around it. So these homeowners had evacuated and they saw images of their house and their community, and it was surrounded by smoke and fire. And they were pretty sure that their home was lost. Well, when they returned after the fire, they were obviously very pleasantly surprised that their home was basically untouched. And this wasn't intentional. They didn't make these changes or do anything ahead of time to prevent the fire from burning their home, but they did make some really good decisions when they built this home. And so we've been looking at that. The fire community has been looking at this for the last 20 or so years to determine what these common denominators are among homes that have made it through a wildfire event with relatively little damage. So things in this image that really stand out to me, first of all, the lack of the trees around it, which is really an ideal situation, but it's not entirely necessary. When we look at the data, it really tells us that the first 30 feet is the most important, from the house 30 feet out, and then up to about 200 feet. That's what really makes the difference. But another couple things about this house, you can look at just how clean it is, basically. So the steel roof is important, but more importantly than that, it's not cluttered with pine needles, leaves, and debris from the previous year. There's not gutters stacked full of that material. There's no wood pile stacked under the deck of this home. And really, it's nice and clean. There's not a lot of vegetative material. There's a nice fire break between the house and the surrounding areas. So all of those things really came into play here when the fire moved through this area. So along with the kind of anecdotal and different after the fact kind of information that we've been gathering from homes that have survived fire, we've looked at how homes actually ignite when a fire passes through. There have been a number of different studies on this, and we mentioned the surface fires and the crown fires previously. So both of those can come in direct contact with your home and ignite the house. But the number one cause for home ignition is the ember attacks or the firebrands. So it's those small pieces of burning material that get lofted through the air ahead of the fire front. And if they land on a receptive fuel, if they land in a gutter full of pine needles or on a wood pile or something like that, that's what's going to ignite your house more times than not. So just keep these in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation here and how that can impact steps you might take. So the steps to becoming Firewise, first would be to understand your risk, which we've talked a little bit about, but there are two other different sorts of evaluations that you can do. The home risk assessment is a do-it-yourself option. It's a simple checklist I'll show you here in a minute. And then the level 1 and level 2 assessments, those are done by trained professionals. So it would be a Firewise specialist like myself, or sometimes some fire departments are trained in this. That's basically, we'll do a level 1 as an aerial photo interpretation. So get a baseline look at your property. And then the level 2 is an on-site evaluation where we go through a very thorough analysis and discuss some of the weak points and strengths and how you can improve the resilience of your property. So the next step, once you understand your risk, the second step would be to practice mitigation or to take some action, right? So there's the building materials are very important. The cleanup and landscaping and access are all different mitigation steps that you can look at. I'm not going to talk a lot about building materials here. I'm going to assume that most of your homes and cabins are built at this point. But if you are building or remodeling, you may want to consider a steel roof or asphalt shingles, flame resistant siding, and some of those other materials that are more flame resistant. The third step would be community involvement. So none of us live in a vacuum. We all have neighbors and community to some degree. And if your property could be the most Firewise or the cleanest, most prepared property around, but if you have a small lot, your neighbor's trees, for example, extend over your property line, or your community access isn't great if you live on perhaps a dead-end street or a soft road with a lot of overhanging trees, that also impacts your fire risk on your property. So it's a good idea to involve neighbors, fire departments, all these other land managers in these discussions. And the ultimate goal then would be a community wildfire protection plan, which is basically a roadmap for identifying the different mitigation steps for the community, and it also opens up a path to funding. So we as the DNR essentially serve as a pass-through grant agency for federal dollars. So once you have that community wildfire protection plan in place, or in fact even the plan writing process itself is an eligible practice. So we can help provide some funding to get those mitigations completed and work towards Firewise communities. So this is that do-it-yourself home risk assessment form. So basically this is just a quick checklist. You'll want to just print this out, take it outside, do a quick walk around your property. It's a great time of year to be doing that. So the first couple questions address that, what we call a defensible space or the home ignition zone. So basically the first 30 feet from around the house. I also want to point out number 5 there. Do you burn brush piles or use a burn barrel? So your burning practices do play into your fire risk. So if you think back to that pie chart I showed earlier, about 38% of fires in Minnesota are from debris burning. That's a lot of where this comes from, which is pretty ironic actually when you think about it. But your burning practices do come into play, so just keep that in mind. Second section would be the driveway access and addressing. So this goes not just for firefighting and fire response, but for any kind of emergency response. If your driveway is clearly marked with your address, it's really going to aid emergency responders in locating your property quickly. But also if your driveway is wide enough and tall enough, and if you have a turnaround, then it's going to be much easier for firefighters and much more likely that they're going to actually be able to bring an engine in to your house, or an ambulance if it was a medical emergency or whatnot. So take a good hard look at your driveway and just see if a fire truck could get down that, if the substrate is solid, if the address is clearly visible from the road, especially at night. Those all come into play as well. And then the third section down at the bottom is the building characteristics. This portion of the form is going to identify just some specific building characteristics, materials, potentially weak points, things that you can mitigate there. So quick home, do-it-yourself option, print this out, walk around your house. It'll give you a good understanding of where you're at right now. So the Firewise literature, a lot of times we talk about these home ignition zones, or that there's a lot of different terminology around it, but basically what it is a graduated system. So you want to, in your mitigation efforts, you want to start at your home and then give your most effort and do the most work immediately at the structure. And then as you move out, your efforts can be lessened, the intensity can be lessened, you can have more vegetation and greater or closer spacing of trees and so on. So it's typically broken down the first 0 to 5 feet. You want no combustible material under your, firewood under your eave, things like that. That's a great place to have, patios or walkways, rock gardens, things like that. If you do want to have some vegetation in here, there's later on in the presentation, I'll have a couple slides on some fire resistant landscaping materials. You want to look at things that don't put on a lot of vegetative growth every year that needs to be pruned, things that don't dry out throughout the season. So things like succulent plants, or hosta is a great example that grows most places, things like that. So first 5 feet, limit as much vegetation as you can, just keep it unburnable to the largest degree. And then once you start moving out, like I said, you can kind of decrease your efforts and intensity. So from 5 feet out to 30 feet, that's where you can start having some trees. We recommend planting deciduous trees instead of conifers within that first 30 feet. Like I mentioned, the pine trees and spruce are much more flammable typically than oak and maple and some of the more common deciduous trees. So think about that, about 20-foot spacing between the crowns in that first 30 feet. And then as you move out, you can get less and less intense in your efforts. So you can have more trees, beyond 30 feet is where you want to store your large firewood piles, where you resupply regularly throughout the winter and so on. So basically what you're after here is a lean, clean, and green home ignition zone. So clean up last year's debris, keep it green, keep it watered, and don't have excess vegetation and debris around. Okay, so another one of the handouts that we're providing here is the home ignition zone mitigation steps. So there's different priorities outlined in this document. So like I said, I'm not going to cover a whole lot of building materials here, but rather focus on cleanup as this number 2, or this mitigation practice here. So a couple things in Minnesota that really are important. A lot of us have decks and elevated porches. So you want to try and keep those as clear of debris as you can. And also, if you're thinking about storing anything underneath, you really want to make sure that you have some good metal mesh screening to prevent those embers from getting under the deck. So an 1/8 inch metal is best, so that wood lattice really doesn't quite cut it in terms of fire prevention there. Firebrands can still get in that lattice material. Gutters, you want to keep those clean. Last year's debris, like I said, it's a receptive fuel bed, and once those embers come in, if they have a receptive fuel bed that they land on, it's be a problem. So it's clear, keep your roof clear, move that firewood pile away from your house. Okay, so the next step would be landscaping. So I mentioned that you don't want to have very much vegetation or flammable material in that first 5 feet around your home. But if you really do like that around your house and you want to try and mitigate fire at the same time, here are some fire resistant plants that you could consider. This is a great publication. It's put out by one of our partners up in the Northeast, the Dovetail Partners, and it has both tree species and plants. So it gives you both, the hardiness zone, the growing conditions that they require, and also the flammability rate. Of course, if you're doing some landscaping, take a look at that. Okay, some other steps around your home, tree spacing and tree pruning. So think back again to that ladder fuel, crown fire, surface fire example that I gave earlier. So we basically want to disrupt the connection between the tree canopies and then the canopy and the surface. So we're looking at tree spacing to prevent that crown to crown spread of fire. So 18 or 20 feet or so between crowns in that first 30 feet. And then as you move out, the trees can get closer and closer together. So 12-foot spacing in that 30 to 60 foot range. And then beyond that, 6-foot spacing. And then pruning, looking at that ladder fuel component, it's a good idea to trim the lower branches of trees. Again, in that, that zone close to your house, the first 30 feet or so. You'd like to prune those branches up 6 to 10 feet, just to disrupt that connection between the surface and the crown, so we can keep fires on the ground where we can handle them. Okay, the next mitigation step here is the access. So I'd mentioned this earlier that, you know, this is a very typical example of a driveway to a house or a cabin in Minnesota. If I was on a fire engine and I was coming up to this house, I'd see this driveway and say, you know what, there's no way I can get down that. You know, if we take a wildland fire where we have maybe 5 engines or so responding, if we send one of those engines into a driveway like this and it's overgrown, or the substrate's too soft and it gets stuck or it can't turn around, we're not only compromising the safety of those firefighters, but we're also limiting the ability of that engine and those firefighters to move on and do some more structure protection or work within that community. So if you have the time and resources to, you know, take a look at your driveway and look at the signage, make sure it's clearly visible. You want to look at the height and the width of the driveway, and then also the substrate, and make sure there's good turnaround for a big vehicle to get in and out. Okay, so the last thing after you've done all your mitigation steps is, like I said, you want to talk to your neighbors and your community members. So we're all in this together. A large fire event basically requires all hands on deck. So that's neighbors, fire departments, emergency managers. You know, there's all sorts of different people involved depending where you live. And then, of course, since I work for the DNR, we have a DNR staff of Firewise specialists that we're here to support you. We serve you as the residents and landowners of Minnesota. We also have a program for high school students. The Minnesota wildfirerisk.org website gives a lot of great resources for some training and some education materials for high school students. There's a number of national programs, the Fire Adapted Communities, the Firewise USA program. I mentioned Dovetail Partners is one of our cooperators in the North. Lots of different resources at your disposal. So please reach out if you do have any questions, and we can help you get connected with the right people and do what you need to do. Okay, and that's pretty much all I have for today. Thanks so much for all your attention and cooperation in this. Like I said, it's a pretty widespread problem. We're all in this together, and the best thing we can do is just share all of our resources that we have with each other, the things that we've learned, and keep moving forward, and all together we can make a difference. So be safe and be prepared, and call us if there's any way we can help you. Thanks so much.